Einstein's renown advanced in fits and starts. In 1902, 1903, he was inventing, in a certain way, the whole science of statistical mechanics, or reinventing and expanding it in novel ways, but it went almost entirely ignored. In 1905, he had that slew of papers we've been discussing: relativity, the quantum of light, Brownian motion, E equals mc squared. Some of them achieved almost instant success. Brownian motion, as a little particle was pushed around by molecules bouncing off it, that became a sensation both for experimentalists and for theorists. Even Poincaré loved that paper. By 1909, however, even the relativity work had begun to get some traction. His ideas of quanta of light suddenly became something that people really could fasten on. But it was only after World War I, after those years of hard winning the battle to find a general theory of relativity, with the eclipse expedition of 1919, that Einstein became a world figure. And it was at that moment, in the late fall, that the art world began to encounter what Einstein had done. The headlines shouted about Einstein's grasp of the bending of starlight in November of 1919. In 1921, Einstein took a world tour, and in every country in which he stopped, everyone celebrated his arrival as a kind of icon of the modern era. Young physicists turned their attention to the kinds of problems that Einstein had made prominent. But it wasn't just physicists. Philosophers began to think about these questions. Artists began to look at it. Architects began to think about it. In fact, you had a whole world opening up to Einstein. But in order to get to that point, and it's the place I want to begin our discussion today, is there was already, in the 1880s and 90s, a fascination among artists with the question of time and space and motion. You could see that, for example, in the work of Edward Muybridge, who came from England when he was about 25 to San Francisco, first as a bookseller and then as a large format photographer who took remarkable and rather daring pictures perched high up in Yosemite. And Muybridge, at the request of the then governor of California, Leland Stanford, began to try to solve the problem that had been vexing Stanford, who owned a large number of racehorses, whether horses, when they were in full gallop, actually kept all four hooves off the ground for certain parts of their gait. And Muybridge thought that was so and had a still picture that seemed to show it, but he went farther and actually created a device that could show you, by putting sequential images on a cylinder, the horse in motion. This was a sensation, and people began to be fascinated by the idea that you could project in a two-dimensional image an actual moving sequence that could come to help us grasp the world. Time and motion and space could be combined inside the image itself. Artists and literary figures also became more and more interested in the new kinds of geometry that so dominated the mid-late 19th century. You had, for instance, Edwin Abbott Abbott, who wrote a book called Flatland in 1884, a kind of social satire, almost Swiftian in its structure, of the nature of Victorian society. He began by imagining a world of only two dimensions. And in those two dimensions, the men were regular polygons and the women were line segments. They had to design houses that would accommodate them, and he began to explore what you would see from one place or another. He said that women were particularly dangerous because if one was coming straight at a poor polygon, the polygon would only see a point and therefore not even notice that anyone was coming until he was speared through and through and would die of his wounds. So there were rules about how women could move in this society, but the parody went on to establish a kind of hierarchy of existence, a kind of metaphysical layer of class and understanding with theological overtones. For example, the book is narrated, in fact it's authored by the humble square, and the humble square can move up and down, sideways on the plane, and he goes to visit a universe that's only a line, a one-dimensional world. And when he visits that world, if he drops in on the line, for instance, he appears as a line as he crosses the larger line. He's just a little line segment, and then he passes through, and then he disappears again. So by angling himself correctly, he can get an eye, which is at one of his corners, to be in the line and observe and communicate with the creatures there. The women in this one-dimensional world are only points, and the men are line segments. Well, they find it very hard to understand what he's talking about. And in parallel to that story, the humble square actually encounters a world more dimensional than his. There's a place called Spaceland, where a sphere, whom he encounters, he's invited by the sphere up into this Spaceland, and the sphere tries to communicate with the world of Flatland what it's like to know a third dimension. But it's almost impossible for the people in the Flatland to grasp this rather theological millennialist existence of the sphere, and they can't accept the knowledge from a dimension above. Well, this story of Edwin Abbott becomes very popular over the years. In fact, it's taken up and celebrated after Einstein's theory as almost as if a kind of prefiguring vision of what Einstein might be.